David Smiley from Tulane University, and that's going to, again, be also as part of our Hispanic Heritage Month presentations. Let me tell you a little bit about Dr. Fontes, which will situate some of the, I think, the research that he'll be presenting today. He's going to present for about 30 minutes or so, and then we wanted to leave time for your questions and answers. But again, we're going to have to really cut it off probably right about 2 so that he can make this connecting slide. So Dr. Fontes is a human geographer and ethnographer. His scholarship focuses on theories of violence, illicit economies, prison worlds, immigration, and Latin America. So for the past 7 years, he's been doing research on the evolution of transnational gangs, which we've been hearing a lot about over the last 12 to 16 to 18 months. Or modest as to understand how they became not only United public enemy #1, but also Central America's public enemy #1. His work maps the blurred boundaries between the underworld, the state, law-abiding society, and legacies of civil war, and that have made the region the most violent non-combat zone in the world. So the research he's going to be presenting today is a forthcoming book called World Without Transnational Gangs and Social Order in Guatemala City, and that's going to be published by University of California Press here within the next 2 months. So he's engaged next 2 weeks even. Wow. Okay. So this is you're getting the first of the research. So this is again a new research project he's working on. Is looking at trafficking networks straddling Guatemala's border with Mexico, and his work's been supported by a number of different grant organizations. He teaches courses on research methods, on Latin American geography, and also will be teaching a course on prison violence and globalization as well. So join and welcome Professor Anthony Fontes.
Thank you very much, Dr. Roper, and thank you so much for the invitation. It's really an honor to be here. And thank you, Lanyon, for treating me so nicely. I'm honest, I don't really want to go home. Life is too good here. Okay, so I'm just going to jump right into it because, as Dr. Roper said, we have some limited time. So this presentation is going to draw from work on mortal doubt, both dissertation and post-dissertation work that I've done over the last 7-8 years in Guatemala City and other Central American cities, as well as in the U.S. A heads up, I'm going to be using a variety of photos and images, most of which I shot myself and some of which are quite graphic, so I guess that's my trigger warning. But this is necessary to my effort to convey how the spectacle of gang violence circulates at multiple scales. We'll understand more about that as we get in. Finally, the scenes and stories that I invoke here are drawn from extensive fieldwork in Central American cities, mostly prisons, gang-dominated neighborhoods, police precincts, courts, etc., and from regional and international news that cycles through at a global level but focuses on Central America. However, as Dr. Roper mentioned, under the present U.S. administration, transnational gangs, especially the Mata Salvatrucha or MS-13, has once again become central to U.S. politics in a big way. So the role that gangs play in providing a sense of order to the chaos of Central American society is being revamped here in the U.S. through the lens of anti-immigration politics. So if I have time, I want to circle back to this issue at the end of the talk, but I would ask you to keep these transnational echoes and resonances in mind as we move through the history, spaces, and spectacles that have made the gangs what they are today. And I'm happy to talk about any of those sorts of resonances after the talk. All right, so without further ado. On February 14th, 2012, a fire ripped through Comayagua prison in Honduras. 377 inmates were burned alive. More than half of these inmates were in pretrial detention, still awaiting their day in court. Along with horrific images of bodies split open like burnt sausages and anguished family members waiting at the gates, rumors quickly surfaced that elements in the Honduran security forces started the fire. Prison guards reportedly shot at prisoners attempting to escape the blaze, and the conflagration was a third of its kind in 7 years and the most deadly. When the news hit the airwaves, I was on my way to court in the Tower of Tribunals in Guatemala City. Riding up in the elevator, a prosecutor turned to his colleague. "It's a message from God," he exclaimed. "What a shame we don't do it like that here. We could finally be done with the gangs, the gang filth and their extortions." The next day, I sat with a former MS-13 leader named Wande in Pavon prison, which is on the outskirts of Guatemala City, judging a Valentine's Day card contest organized by a gang rehabilitation organization in which I volunteered. The 3 finalists creations to feature Tweety Bird, Tigger, and a sad little blonde boy. Well, the winners collected their prizes. One day, who's pictured here, pored over front-page photographs of the charred dead. I recounted the conversation I had overheard, and he sat mulling it over for a moment and then cracked a sad smile. They think they can burn the devil out, he said, but wouldn't that mean setting fire to the whole world? So maras, or transnational gangs, took root in Central America nearly 30 years ago, just as the region's Cold War conflicts were ending. At the time, they were little more than disorganized groups of youth imitating Los Angeles-born Latino gangs vying for turf cities struggling to recover from authoritarian rule. Over the years, however, they've evolved into brutal organizations engaged in extortion, contract killings, and the drug trade. Feuds between Barrio 18, or 18th Street, and Mara Salvatrucha, or MS-13, the two most powerful maras in Central America, have helped to turn the region into the most violent non-combat zone in the world. At the same time, maras and mareros, or gangsters, with their penchant for conspicuous tattoos and audacious violence, have become archetypal symbols of all that has gone wrong in Central America. What's more, and as I'm going to discuss today, they are central to both the politics of imprisonment and the politics of death in Central America and beyond. So I arrived in Guatemala City in 2010. I'm sure you're all familiar with this particular image of the maras. I arrived in Guatemala City in 2010 to begin field research that I hoped would penetrate the haze of fear and fantasy that swirls about these gangs. Along with other cities in the northern triangle of Central America, which is Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, this metropolis of some 7 million citizens suffered under the gang phenomenon. And it's poor neighborhoods and sprawling suburbs, as well as in the nation's overcrowded prison system. And in this city, as in cities across the region, the rise of the maras has been concomitant with the onset of a new kind of insecurity. This is not the overtly political and ethnic violence of prior epochs, which killed some 150,000 people and disappeared almost 50,000. Today, Guatemala City is a time and place dominated by both fact and fear of out-of-control crime. Following the signing of peace accords in 1996, the nation's homicide rate climbed to 40 per 100,000, fifth highest in the world. Between 2000 and 2008, Guatemala City's homicide rate doubled, with numbers climbing to as high as 60 per 100,000. Today, in the city's so-called red zones, which are poor, insecure neighborhoods dominated by gangs and other illicit organizations, security officials claim that homicide rates shoot up to over 190 per 100,000. Such homicide rates can be found in large cities and some rural areas across the region. But in a sense, such body counts obscure more than they reveal. As hard and fast as these numbers may seem, what makes this violence so terrifying for so many is its profound uncertainty. Less than 5% of violent crimes ever make it to trial, less than 2% if the victim is a female, making Guatemala a great place to commit murder. Forces of order and disorder often make distorted reflections of each other. At best, the law appears helpless, and at worst, complicit, making the list of usual suspects in every murder, extortion, and kidnapping long and badly defined. And police regularly exchange places with drug traffickers, kidnapping ring gangs, and other criminal groups that they're meant to arrest. Meanwhile, massacre, torture, and dismemberment have become popular techniques to make murder register far and wide. The cacophony of public reaction, sensationalist media reporting, politicians grandstanding, the rumors coursing through violence-stricken communities warp this fear into every realm of public life. Thus, Guatemala City is one of those spaces dominated by what Hannah Arendt would call the all-pervading unpredictability of violence. In the contemporary world, such spaces are legion. Since the end of the Cold War, the democratic wave and the triumph of market fundamentalism has been accompanied by a gradual erasure of received lines between the informal and the illegal, regulation and irregularity, order and organized lawlessness. This is especially so in Central America's Northern Triangle, where states have become criminal, criminals counterfeit the state, and those caught in the middle are left to muddle through as best they can. With so many murders left unsolved and unpunished, overwhelming doubt haunts collective perceptions of danger and mires every avenue of investigation. As a veteran homicide investigator with the National Police said, a death may occur for a failure to pay extortion. A death, well, may occur because of a drug-related settling of accounts and have nothing to do with the gangs. And that's all one can say. From behind his cluttered desk, he fixed me with an incongruous grin and said, "You might die because your brother got caught up with the maras." Who can say with more specificity? There are many acts that have such consequences. Extreme levels of violence arising from such inscrutable sources cast long shadows over Guatemala City. Violence and its terror dictate how city residents think and live. People cast about for ways of making sense of what has become a war without sense. These struggles to make sense of senselessness, to draw meaning and certainty out of cycles of violence that refuse to be fixed in time and place, converge upon the figure of the Madero, or gangster. Actors of all kinds draw on him to make meaning in political discourse, newspaper and TV headlines, casual conversation and rumors, and daydreams and nightmares. For Guatemalans from all walks of life, this figure has come to personify all the wounds of the struggling social body. Thrust into the public imagination, the symbolic power of the Madero fuses everyday violence taking place in gang-dominated territories and other insecure spaces to the making of social and political perspectives dictating life across the country, the city, and beyond. However, keep in mind that the Mara, this public enemy number one, is not a discrete thing separable from social networks and structures of violence that trespass the blurred boundaries linking the world to the underworld upon which it rests. So like I said, this is an image that I think most people in this room will be familiar with as the face of these gangs. Part of my work is to try to dig beneath these spectacular images and try to show other faces of what these gangs are and how they become what they are. So for instance, these are 6 affiliates, alleged affiliates of the gang extortion network. They're the mothers, wives, sisters, lovers of incarcerated gang members who were arrested for being part of an extortion network. Or this face of the Mara, an incarcerated Madero and his daughter on visiting day in the Guatemalan prison. Or this face. This is a young man named Chucky, who's about 19, he'd be almost 25 now. And he's got about 45 years left on his sentence. The reason I show this image and why it fascinates me so much, not only the dolls that he keeps here for his family visits, but this image, this drawing he made of himself with his 4-year-old daughter, how nuanced the picture of his daughter is and how caricatured the picture of himself is. So, like savage others, raised up through history and across cultures, the Mara's image expresses and shrouds and eclipses the complex structural and historical forces that make the catastrophic present so deeply uncertain, becoming another justification for savagery in the name of law and order, promised by so-called civilization. They are foot soldiers in a vague and dystopian civil war. They are inhuman and unfeeling killers who do not fear death. They're youth trying to protect themselves or maybe just get some style. They're boys struggling to become men, parasites feeding off of collective fear, byproducts of consumer capitalism, and souls lost along a path blazing into an ungodly future. For some, the Mara's willingness to kill and die have made them useful mercenaries following the orders of higher powers. For others, gangs are simply an ugly expression of a collective fall from grace and loss of traditional values. I asked Walter Villatoro, a well-respected criminal circuit judge, why Maras have become so violent. Aha, he thundered, pounding his desk. I'll tell you, we become rotten from the beginning. It starts with cesarean sections, the separation of child from mother, feeding newborns animal milk, and leaving them alone in their cribs. The gangs are the vomit of a sick society. So in short, these brash vehicles of violence and emissaries of peacetime chaos have become absolutely essential to the making of a certain kind of order. Maras form a vital node, a flashpoint, in which overwhelming violence and fear circulating throughout the social body come into stark relief. They are, in a sense, a way for people to know violence and its terror, or at least to pretend to know. A way of providing a discernible form to endless unknowns that make life under such circumstances so difficult. They have become means of rendering the illegible legible, of imposing a sense of finitude and control onto out-of-control insecurity. They become the answer when no answers are enough. In a world that always appears to be coming undone, the Maras play a pivotal role in holding it together. What's more, such meaning-making is by no means isolated from the ongoing destruction of bodies, communities, and lives it's meant to keep at bay. Efforts to explain and make sense of this kind of violence have knock-on effects that are absolutely pivotal to these perpetual cycles. So at the heart of moral doubt is this endless enmeshing between, on the one hand, imagining the world, and the other hand, the making of the world. Through the history, spaces, businesses, and violent spectacles through which the Mara phenomenon has evolved, I try to trace the deadly play between out-of-control predation, overwhelming uncertainty, and desperate struggles to carve a sense of certainty back in. by tracing the promiscuous exchange between the material, what gangs do, where and how they do it, and the symbolic, how they're framed in the media, in politics, and everyday conversation, I show how the Mata's flesh and blood violence is indissoluble from their power and social imaginaries, and how they provide cover for a host of other actors feeding off profound insecurity. A little bit of a roadmap here. This is parts 1, 2, and 3 of the book. Part 1, Truths and Fictions, maps the importance of rumors, fantasies, and outright lies, and how mainstream society has come to understand gangs, their past and present. Part 2, Worlds and Underworlds, expands out from Matas into the prison system in the city to show how a myriad of actors, the state, private security, corporations, military men, among others, feed and feed off the struggle to impose order on peacetime violence. And finally, Part 3, Spectacle, Structure, and Agency, explores how the spectacle of gang violence is produced and consumed on both national and global scales, making accomplices of even the most distant witnesses, and undermining the very possibility of innocence for any of us. So today I'm going to draw from chapters on porous prisons and spectacular violence in an effort to respond to Wande's initial observation. If the devil, so to speak, can't be trapped in the prisons, where is he to be found? In the details, no doubt. So much has been written about how essential prisons are for providing a sense of security, even when they do not, by and large, actually make society safer. This is especially so in Guatemala and other parts of Central America, where the belief that prisons could actually quarantine criminals and keep society safe is widely understood as a misbegotten fallacy. It all comes back to prisons, lamented a Guatemala City criminal circuit judge, and no one wants to deal with it. Collective rage and frustration over Central American states' failure to punish evildoers, which may have fueled that Comayagua prison fire that I began with, and certainly inspired the celebratory reactions like the one I observed in the elevator, belie how deeply implicated institutions of punishment are with the rise of peacetime crime. Case in point, the penal state has been an unwitting midwife to the Mata's metamorphosis. For Mareros, prison has long been both an expected way station and a central point of organization and cultural reproduction. Beginning in the late 1990s and growing into the early 2000s, Guatemala was caught up in the regional hysteria over the unprecedented growth of post-Cold War crime. Pantomiming Honduras and El Salvador, the Guatemalan government organized a massive assault on the gang threat. It didn't have the far-reaching judicial enforcement initiatives that other neighbors' full-blown mano dura policies did. However, government efforts still resulted in the arrests of thousands of poor urban youth. Some were bona fide gangsters, but the vast majority were not. By the early 2000s, prisons in Guatemala, as in Honduras and El Salvador, were packed full of mareros alongside young men who became easy fodder for gang recruitment as they took on the group identity foisted upon them by police profiling. They found themselves trapped behind bars, fighting for survival against rival prisoner factions. Rival gangs learned to cooperate with each other inside prison to survive and profit from that ebb and flow of prison life, the constant game of tug-of-war between prison officials and prisoner factions. In prison, gang leaders formed what became known as the Wheel of the Barrio, Rueda del Barrio, through which the most powerful leaders met and coordinated trade in weapons, soldiers, and territorial claims on the outside. Surviving leaders even claimed to have ordered homies on the street to intentionally get arrested. Through calculated misbehavior and disruption, they sought to have Marero prisoners transferred to select facilities in order to gain numeric dominance. Such strategies helped to make the Maras a force to be reckoned with throughout the prison system. However, prison walls are not enough to contain the suffering that prison life creates. Which brings me to Made for Media Murder. In July 2010, incarcerated leaders in Mara Salvatrucha planned and ordered a quadruple murder and decapitation, carried out by street operatives to protest the loss of prison privileges. The victims should have no relationship whatsoever to the Mara Salvatrucha or its rival Barrio 18. The leadership wanted the message pure, untainted by gang rivalries. After all, it's relatively easy for the general population to dismiss murdered gangsters. The random victims strike fear because they could be you. The imprisoned leaders, in fact, wanted their message to go beyond Guatemala. Make it a global, the gang leader told the gathered gang members. That is, perform an act of violence that gets taken up into the international news stream. That night, various Mara Salvatrucha cells called 4 victims, all of them young men, from poor, insecure urban neighborhoods, and placed each head in a place of political, economic, or mediatic significance. So this crime of the four heads was meant to create a spectacle in the public eye and show the world the power of the Mara Salvatrucha. In many ways, this is simply a new page in an old script. Whether through dramatic displays of overwhelming force, think of United States' shock and awe campaign in the Second Gulf War, or more intimate brutality, carefully staged for dissemination, lynchings of black men in the US South during the Civil Rights era, or ISIS's designed for YouTube decapitation videos. Spectacles of violence and suffering are key to a certain kind of performance of power. But the efficacy of such acts hinges on a complex question. Whose suffering counts? In post-war Guatemala, acts of spectacular violence, massacre, dismemberment, decapitation, etc., and reveal a particular economy of suffering. While perpetrators of this kind of performance may intend their actions to have a specific political effect, that intention is not always realized, and the repercussions will always range far beyond what they may have conceived. Spectacles are not mere images or collection of images. They're produced through social interactions and relationships. Ultimately, neither perpetrator nor victim dictate what such performance means. The audience does. And so, rooting this public brutality in the Maras elides how the crucible of post-war Guatemala, alongside a global media hungry for violent sensation, has forged Maras into a limit point of criminal violence. As Mareros continue to kill and die in breathtaking numbers, they become a kind of shorthand in the vernacular of violence. And this has consequences. Their will to excessive violence cannot be disentangled from how the Maras, as both source and target of murder, have come to more a floating sense of fear and uncertainty haunting post-war life. From indifference to horror, fascination to fatigue, made-for-media murder like T.S. Eliot's Magic Lantern throws the nerves and patterns on the screen, exposing in gory detail collective conceptions of unjust suffering and deserved death, circulating throughout Central American societies and beyond. In the crime of the four heads, to make their otherwise unremarkable victims matter, street operatives place the heads at various locations around the city in the early morning. One in front of a popular shopping mall, one at the entrance of the Congressional Building, one at the fire station where journalists were known to congregate, another in a middle-class neighborhood. With each head, they left a message addressing the government. One read simply, "No more impunity." Another complained of injustice in the prison system. As both victims and perpetrators, Maras play a pivotal role in the discourse of suffering bodies. The media, the government, and the public use the figure of the Marero to anchor anxieties over violence that often appears to have come unmoored from all sense and reason. Dead Marero bodies, or bodies labeled as such, have become central nodes through which a frightened public metabolizes a creeping sense of helplessness, confusion, and despair. As Nietzsche observed, what really arouses indignation against suffering is not suffering as such, but the senselessness of suffering. Marero's suffering is easily justified, and murdered Mareros need not be mourned. And any sign of gang association, determined by myriad factors relating to age, dress, geography, and so on, can make a victim unmournable. Thus, brutal spectacle becomes woven out of everyday structural and symbolic violence. September 30th, 2011. Notes from some of my field notes. Today, like every other day, the first 3 pages of Nuestro Diario, which is one of the most popular newspapers in Central America, are dedicated to murder of every kind. Dismembered bodies dredged up outside of Mexico. They kill a Marero, spelled out in huge capitals, and a close-up of the cadaver's tattoos. The faces of a woman and a girl child and boy child on his bicep, Gabby drawn in Gothic calligraphy, a gun on his belly. Somewhere else, the Santa Muerte. The headline claims that he was the head of a gang that conducted extortion rackets, though the 100-word article contains nothing to back this up. The next page shows 2 separate massacres. 2 women killed with multiple gunshots in Zone 3 of the city. And a quote from a local business owner. Regrettably, some girls get involved with the gangs, and this kills them. A tortured, tattooed corpse immediately becomes a gangster's body, an extortionist's body. The body is intact, but the imagery robs the corpse of its human wholeness by showing only its tattoos, focusing in on these symbols of social subversion that for many Guatemalans are prima facie evidence of guilt. The other stories relate with no details at all the murders of 2 women, with only a glib quote linking the girls' deaths to association with gangs. It's the association that kills, whoever the murderer might be. Bodies stained with Mara markings, so intensely visible as killers and signs of social subversion, make the violence they've come to represent more easily metabolized. As murder rates have risen beyond all previous levels, the collective struggle to create distance from so much death has pushed many victims into the same category as their killers. These people, as the saying goes, must have been involved in something. The intensive, what Teresa Caldera calls the intensive symbolic labor to differentiate the image of the criminal as far as possible from oneself extends not only to perpetrators of violence, but to their victims. And over time, such elision has driven gaming strategies. Sitting in the prison yard, Mo, an incarcerated Mara Salvatrucha member with 40 years left on his sentence, told me, "Before, you could intimidate just with words, but then people didn't listen so much, so you had to really scare them. People today don't even pay attention if you kill someone with a shooting. It's just a lost bullet. Today you have to dismember and terrorize the people if you want to have power." So what are the ways that certain acts of violence and certain kinds of suffering gain power in the public sphere while others do not? In the crime of the four heads, for example, the Mara masqueraded as police and mimed a military execution. They attached to these bodies messages: no more impunity, no more injustice, echoing human rights vernacular, language that has become central to collective efforts to resist environmental injustice, government corruption, elite malfeasance, and so on. They made this suffering count by placing the heads outside the spaces already associated with violence. They couldn't remain in the ghetto because violence in the ghetto is something so normal. It had to be taken out of that geography. By masquerading as police come death squads, mouthing the refrain of rights, and speaking their grievances through innocent corpses, the Mara Salvatrucha took on multiple roles in its post-war pageantry. And all this to make their demands heard and make murder matter amidst the cacophony of everyday violence, if only for an ephemeral media moment. However, they failed to break through into the global, to make it a global, as they had intended. This never made the international news. A stringer for Reuters in Guatemala tried to run this story, but his editors in Mexico City, in the Mexico City office refused. The market for massacres is cutthroat competitive. On a slow day, they require at least 10 undone bodies for a massacre in Central America to become international newsworthy. Less than that, and it's not a story worth telling. So all this was in 2012. 6 years later, and the motto's role in ordering a transnational politics of fear has evolved and expanded in the United States beyond anything that I could have imagined from Guatemala City 6 years ago. So violence and poverty in Central America have been driving out migration for generations. Over the last decade, we've seen surges of Hondurans, Salvadorans, and Guatemalan migrants and asylum seekers seeking refuge and prosperity in the United States. This became a hot-button issue once again under the Obama administration, which, by the way, deported more immigrants than any administration in U.S. history. These are numbers for unaccompanied minors coming from Central America. I don't know, in 2014, if anyone recalls some of the protests both in favor and against these unaccompanied minors and all the politics that follows since. And since I finished this project, the Trump administration has continued to push for a big, beautiful wall along the U.S.-Mexican border to keep out the so-called drug dealers, criminals, and rapists, and I quote, threatening peaceful American communities and poor and hungry masses, taking American jobs. In spectacular fashion, the 2016 presidential campaign and election of Donald Trump exposed just how shaky the United States society's sense of order has become. Tapping into seething anxieties over the national political, economic, and racial order, Trump rode a tide of fear, rage, and indifference into the White House. And as president, he's continued to draw from the same playbook. Like so many right-wing politicians in the United States and elsewhere, he gathers strength and support by invoking images of violent others, upon which he heaps blame for the loss of U.S. citizens' quality of life. During his first year in office, this list of enemies evolved to include, among many others, Mara Salvatrucha. As part and parcel of the administration's campaign to reform the U.S. immigration system, it has thrust the Mara Salvatrucha before the national public to feed the fantasy that savage foreigners are turning U.S. cities into so-called blood-stained killing fields. Across the country, right-wing politicians have been using the specter of the MS-13 to bludgeon their opponents. This is from a campaign ad for the race for governor in Virginia, attacking a Democratic candidate for increasing the threat of MS-13. Quite graphic. This year, in a disastrous show of force, as I'm sure all of you know, the U.S. government even resorted to ripping immigrant children away from their parents and keeping them in cages, perhaps in an attempt to leverage their suffering for political gain. Such Machiavellian calculation and savage disregard for its consequences, for me anyway, are all too familiar. Ironically, in the name of keeping the violence and chaos of Central American societies at bay, the U.S. government is employing scripts and symbols drawn directly from Central American politics that have been integral to the rise of Mata's and extreme peacetime violence in the first place. Just as Trump relies on MS-13 to anchor the imagined ills of immigration in the United States, politicians and publics across the globe are turning and returning to fascist visions of order. Such visions rely on precisely the same kind of othering discourses, authoritarian instincts, and fearful ferment integral to the making of the Matas and so many other vehicles of violence. The targets of these revanchist political projects are legion. Those who would rule draw on their images to carve out the battle lines of 21st century survival and pull the ties that bind human society into an unruly whole. The sense of collective certainty that they strive to instill must necessarily be short-lived, relying as it does on the specter of barbarous others perpetually threatening to tear it asunder. There is no outside of these conflicts, and there are no outsiders. As both producers and consumers of the world we live in, we cannot stop our conscription into the struggle for order. We're all the train upon which these struggles take place, and must make the choice to act consciously or remain mere mindless fodder. This means wrestling with the intense discomfort, if not the outright horror, that comes with facing up to such ethical and existential confusion. It means acknowledging that all of us, victims and perpetrators, experts and lay people, witnesses, both distant and near, are also ensnared in a tangled skein out of which the Matas emerge. Thank you.
We have some time for questions, and so I'll just open up the floor.
Yeah, maybe if there's a couple, I'll take a couple at a time, and then we can go back. Yeah.
I was just wondering, what's the first part of your book? What's it called?
Mortal Doubt. Yeah.
You mentioned that throughout there that there's a kind of a dehumanization of these gang members and how that the homicides that they do, the killings and all that is kind of a spectacle, and that people become desensitized to it. So is the solution for reducing all of this does it call for like more awareness and social structure? Because obviously throwing them all into the prisons just strengthens them.
Right.
And then everyone's go-to answer is to kill them or burn them.
Right, absolutely. So your question is,
It's
like growing some sort of awareness. We're looking for a solution on how to solve this stuff.
Because the solution isn't prisons or violence.
Yeah, it's not prisons or violence. I think awareness is the word. I think that's the catchword. But it's tough because once you get into the politics of spectacular violence, right? And you want to stay in tune and pay attention to what's going on. But in becoming involved in the clickbait of spectacular violence, one gets drawn into this process of giving attention for exactly the kind of things that we don't want to give attention for. I do think that trying to get beneath the spectacle is the most important thing. And that can work to a limited degree for people who are willing to try to really face up to the structural issues that cause it. For me, I think one of the most important messages is that we tend to treat, in the US anyway, we tend to treat the violence that's happening in Central America as a Central American problem that needs to be contained there. But if you look at the cycles of history, of exchange of bodies, politics, commodities, and illicit and licit between the Central American region and the US, you come to understand, and this is one of my arguments, is that we're utterly fused. What's happening in Central America is a direct product of things that happen here in the US and vice versa. Right? So it's that kind of, what I call it, radical empathy that is necessary. It seems very far away, but yeah, radical empathy and awareness of history and how the ties that bind us through those historical cycles is absolutely necessary. Good question. See a hand? Yeah.
So, what exactly, do these gangs want?
What do they want?
Yeah.
That's a good question. Another question here?
Yeah, can you explain, please, on how is how would be the U.S. government or the United States in general responsible for what has happened in Central America and Republic?
Great question. Okay. Yeah, what do they want? It's not a singular thing, right? And there's a lot of work looking at why individual members join. And I started to sort of name that sort of litany of things, right? So as in many of these neighborhoods, people join gangs because for self-protection. You join the gang or you're going to be targeted by the gang. So it's one way. Or if you don't join the gang, then you'll be targeted by the other gang. So it's a form of self-protection. Especially for people who live in, coming from broken homes and don't have other networks that can protect them, that becomes a primary draw for them. But there's a difference between those people who are joining for their own self-protection and the leaders at the top, right? Many of whom, as I thought, have been incarcerated sometimes for decades. And so one of the main things that has shifted the way they operate has been because the cerebral part of the gang, a part of the gang that thinks and takes action, makes decisions, are housed in prison. So in some ways, they're literally, what do they want? They want to survive, they want to live pretty well, and they want their families to be okay, right? So how do you do that from inside prison? You do it by leveraging your control over street operatives to work in extortion, drug trade, and so on and so forth. The difficult part of that is that what is essentially happening is the logics that govern prison, and prison is governed by violence. The most violent individual, it's about savvy, but it's also about the most violent individuals tend to be able to take over and take control of prison. And so what essentially exporting the logics of prison that which has been absolutely created by systems of mass incarceration, exported by the US as well, and exported those logics to the street, such that that kid that just wants to join the gang to survive is actually taking orders from imprisoned, hardened gangsters who are willing to do anything to get what they want. So I know it's a roundabout way of answering your question, but it depends on who you're talking to and at what level in the hierarchy they are. They sit. So also, gangs are not as, the Mata Salvatrucha, there's been a lot of talk about the Mata Salvatrucha being a transnational gang network. And these gangs are social organizations before they are criminal organizations, in the sense that, yes, they have a transnational reach, but it's not like it's a pyramidal scheme where the leadership in El Salvador is going to control what happens in Langley Park, Maryland, right? It's much more of a social relationships that make for transnational cultures in the same way that immigrant communities are related to the communities, the immigrant diasporas are related to the country from which they come. So it's important to remember that there isn't some like grand Mata Salvatrucha plan. They don't have a consolidated plan of what they're going to do, but rather individual cliques trying to survive and use the Mata Salvatrucha brand to help their business model, so to speak. So the responsibility of the U.S. government. It's you could start in a lot of different places. Let's start during the Cold War. So in particular Guatemala in particular, the U.S. It's one of the initial moves of the CIA, a first sort of undercover ops of the CIA to try to take down a communist government, happened with Guatemala's second elected, democratically elected president, a guy named Guatemala Benz, 1954. U.S. toppled him with a shock and awe campaign because his administration was threatening the interests of a major multinational company called United Fruit. That was actually on the board of that were the Dulles brothers. Dulles Airport, John Foster Dulles, Allen Dulles, head of the CIA, head of the State Department during this time, advisors to Eisenhower. Also were on the board of this United Fruit Company who owned something like 80% of the arable land in Guatemala. And Escobar Benz was promising a land reform, and so they called him communist, beginning of the Cold War, so the U.S. went and toppled him. Since 1954, up until 1996, so we're talking 40 years, Guatemala was more or less in a state of civil war that rose and fell in different places and had different pockets. And so what the U.S. did was pull the rug out from under the chance for a normal functioning democracy and made such that big military regimes ruled the country for decades. And that legacy of what happened during the Civil War, which is one of the bloodiest on the continent, a tiny country, but the numbers killed are beyond almost any conflict in the Western Hemisphere. We'll get there. It has left deep scars on the social body in Guatemala. Same thing happened in El Salvador and Honduras in other ways as well. Has been a U.S. military base. So we have that Cold War history to draw from. At the same time, you have, since then, you know, Cold War ends 1990, and the U.S. focus U.S. focus moves to the danger of immigration. So in early 90s, you had a deep reaction against immigrants. It had to do with Rodney King riots and sort of the spectacle of what minority communities were doing in cities and so on and so forth. Gangs especially became sort of a focus point. You had a bunch of laws passed in the early 90s that increased the process of deportation. Anybody know what president passed the most draconian anti-immigration laws in U.S. history? Anyone want to take a guess? Bill Clinton, absolutely. You guess. Bill Clinton, she got it. 1996, IRA, I'll call IRA, which this increasing levels of deportation that we've seen since then have everything to do with the laws that were passed in 1996. So what I'm saying is that at precisely the moment that civil wars were ending in Central America, civil wars had been fomented and the conditions had been created with help from the United States, the U.S. started deporting all sorts of criminal and criminalized immigrants back to their countries of origin. This is how the gangs got started. You know, these gangs started in LA and then got through deportation. They seeded big cities like Guatemala City, San Salvador, and exploded in these countries that were trying to recover from years of authoritarian rule. So we can leave it there. There's a lot of other ways, but I think those are two major ways. I saw a hand over here.
Oh, I was just asking, for the Civil War that happened in Guatemala, how long did it last? From
60 to 96. 60 to 96 are the official dates, but it's more like waves of violence that happened through there. The worst was in early 1980s when what the United Nations has called genocide was perpetrated by a U.S.-backed government in Guatemala against mostly indigenous population. Yeah, the vast majority were killed during that time. Yes, Barbara?
Yeah. How has the Guatemalan military responded? And have they used a draft? Or these are just mainly young men?
Right.
I just wondered, if there are
Right.
any dynamics of that.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. One of the ways that right-wing politicians and the old guard of the old elite, same elite that was involved in doing the massacres and genocide of the Civil War, they treat the gang, the discourse they treat the gang as their guerrilla 2.0, right? That these are political organizations and that the response that is needed is to remilitarize society, right? To bring order through remilitarization of society. And so it's become across the region, and hyper insecurity across Latin America has been used in the same way. And people even evince a nostalgia. One of the most disturbing things for me. The conditions are so difficult in present day under severe insecurity. People will talk about nostalgic for the days of military rule, right? When at least then, if you didn't get involved in politics, you could imagine yourself safe. This is a time when people are being disappeared, massacred, tortured by the military. So the right-wing politicians have used this to their advantage in the sense of calling for a return to military rule. And mano dura policies, strong fist, is essentially a military answer. And what's so interesting about that, though, is that these responses of hyper-mass incarceration, of treating it as if a guerrilla problem has led to this metamorphosis that's made them much more widespread and much more corporatized and organized entities than they ever were before those processes started. Good question.
We've got time for one more question, please.
Yeah.
Do you know if there's been any efforts by maybe the government or the church, or I don't know, to talk to these head of the gangs that are imprisoned for so long that anyway they will not,
Right.
to try to.
Yeah, sort of negotiate or
Yeah.
try to. I mean, the only place where it's happened. I don't have an image. Let's see. Only place where it's happened is in. So this guy was a major leader, El Soldado, the soldier, major leader of the Mara Salvatrucha, who kind of took on that role of trying to, advertise and work with the police to soften the image of gangsters in society, talk about the structural issues that move and make things so difficult. He was actually gunned down for his troubles, I think, and rumor has it that it was actually by both police and gangsters his effort to make peace for the streets threatened their businesses that they managed to maintain. The only country where there was an effort to work with imprisoned leaders to use their power to make peace on the streets was in El Salvador. And it was pretty amazing. El Salvador's, each country, the gang phenomenon is different. But in El Salvador, gangs are the only illicit business in town. They are they're deeply, deeply powerful. Guatemala, 80–90% of the cocaine that gets to the US goes to Guatemala. So you also have narco traffickers and all sorts of other illicit organizations, and gangs are one among many. But in places like El Salvador, they are a major force, a major political force as well. So this happened in 2014. The Salvadoran government, through a Catholic church and some other agents that have relationships with gang leaders, tried to forge a tregua, a peace pact, a truce, thank you. What was amazing was that overnight, within a week, El Salvador's murder rate dropped by more than half, almost 2/3. And it maintained itself for 6 months until the whole thing sort of unraveled and it fell apart again. Part of the issue is, again, as I was saying, this game, it's not structured, it's not organized crime. We're not talking about the mafia here with a deeply structured top-down control. There's a lot of autonomy depending on the country, depending on the gang. And so trying to work at that level has very mixed results. It's very mixed results. Excellent question. I saw a hand go up there. No?
So I think unfortunately we're probably at
Cool.
the end of our time here, but maybe once we break, we'll be able to have, if anyone wants to talk to Dr. Ponce pretty quickly, there'll be an opportunity. Please join us in thanking him. And again, we'll be having a talk on October 19th.